Good morning. Pardonnez-moi, je ne parle pas français. I will be speaking in English this morning. So picking up on what we've just discussed, I'm going to be starting with the state of the economy and what it's been looking like lately vis-a-vis actually the last few decades, because there's some interesting patterns there, and that's going to launch into a conversation about what's going on with productivity, and that's how we'll be spending much of the rest of the morning discussing various aspects of that. So I'm an economist who studies productivity, and there are many ways to measure it, but it's a very important number. And no matter how you measure it, it all boils down to being some ratio of output to inputs. So it's how much product is being made relative to the amount of inputs put into the product. Now you can measure productivity at the economy-wide level. You can measure it at the industry level, the company level, and even the individual level if you'd like. It's the measure of output, the measure of inputs varies with that, but they're all again measures of what you can think of as efficiency, how efficient the production process is, how much stuff you get out of a given set of inputs. And if you look at what productivity means for the economy as a whole, it's basically the one number that in the long run is the most important thing. And that's because it effectively sets the speed limit on economic growth. So there basically is no other way to get sustained growth in output or in GDP per capita, measures of a measure of economic activity without productivity growth. And what that means is if you have a sustained period where there's a decline in productivity growth, you're likely to see accompanying that a sustained period with a decline in economic growth and growth in material well-being. And so when economists are looking at the long-run health of the economy, one of the first things they're going to look at is what productivity growth has been doing, because it is, again, the only real way you get sustained increases in standards of living, material standards of living in the long run. So if you look what's been going on around the world, we are about 10 to 15 years into a slowdown in productivity growth. This is almost without exception. So 29 of the 30 OECD countries for which we have data saw a slowdown in productivity growth from the decade 1995 to 2004 to the post-2004 period. And I've shown you the numbers up here for Switzerland and for its neighboring economies, along with the United States. The top row shows average annual productivity growth, and here we're talking about output per worker hour. So this is the change from year to year in the average amount of output a given worker makes in an hour in this economy, okay, for each of these various countries. So Switzerland, for example, between 1995 and 2004, the average annual increase in output per hour was about 1.4%. Since that time, since 2005, it's fallen to 1% per year growth. So that's a slowdown of 0.4% per year. Now, if you probably noticed already, Switzerland actually has one of the slowest or one of the smallest slowdowns of all the countries. But it is experiencing a productivity growth slowdown, but it's not as large as others. For example, France has seen a decline in productivity growth of 1.2% per year since the mid-2000s, and the United States has fallen from 2.8% per year in the 95 to 2004 period to 1.3% per year afterwards, and so a decline of 1.5% per year. Now you might say, well, okay, I see that's a slowdown, but those numbers don't seem too high, 0.4% per year. What does that matter? Well, it turns out if you have a slowdown of that magnitude for a year, it isn't that important. But if it's sustained over a long period, it really does add up. And I'll show you how much it adds up to in a second. Before that, I just want to note that this slowdown is not being caused by any given sector. that's dominating the others or seeing more of a slowdown than the others. So if you look at the breakout, and these numbers are again also for Switzerland, you see the productivity growth slowdown happening sector by sector as well. So in the manufacturing construction sectors, there was a slowdown. There was a slowdown in agriculture, forestry, and fishing, and also a slowdown in the services industry. Okay, and that's not unique to Switzerland. Just about all of the countries I've shown you, this productivity slowdown is widespread. It's not just hitting in, say, manufacturing. It's hitting in manufacturing, it's hitting in services, it's hitting in construction, and so on and so forth. So it seems to be a very widespread phenomenon. By the way, I mentioned about the OECD countries. These are the more developed economies of the world, but we also have seen a productivity slowdown in the emerging economies of the world. So China has seen a considerable drop in productivity growth. Indonesia has, Brazil certainly. So again, this seems to be a worldwide phenomenon. Since about the emerging economies, the slowdown started a little later, around the time of the financial crisis, as opposed to earlier in the 2000s, as with the OECD countries. But nevertheless, it seems like most of the major economies of the world have seen a decline in productivity growth. And this, as I mentioned, adds up. Okay, so as modest as the slowdown has been for Switzerland, a drop in 0.4% per year of productivity growth, if you sustain that long enough, it starts adding up. So for example, had productivity growth in Switzerland stayed at its level, average level that it was at from 95 to 2004, GDP now in Switzerland this year would be approximately 41 billion francs larger than it is now. So that's 5,000 francs per capita. Okay, that's a considerable amount of lost economic activity, lost income, because productivity growth slowed down relative to what it was the decade prior. The comparable number for the United States is even larger. If you remember, the US saw a larger slowdown. Had productivity growth not slowed from its 1995 to 2004 level in the US, GDP in the United States would be about 17% higher, $12,000 per capita. So almost twice the size of the lost output that Switzerland is implied to be suffering. So that's the data. We go look at one of the most important measures of long-run economic growth, and we see bad news. You contrast that on the other side with technological optimism coming from many quarters. Certainly you see it from folks in the technology industry. It's not hard to go find quotes like the ones I'm showing here, where the world is changing faster than we've ever seen before. We're going to be able to do amazing new things that no one ever imagined. The speed of business is at unrelenting levels, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So you've got that on one hand, and it's not, now, perhaps technological people would be expected to say those sorts of things, but it's not pure boosterism. There are real hard metrics of technological progress that are impressive. So, for example, in terms of image recognition algorithms, the progress has been notable over the past 6 or 7 years. About 2 years ago, we got to the point where image recognition algorithms can, at least in certain scenarios, consistently have error rates below 5%. Why is that important? Well, 5% is about what you would expect an untrained human to do. So this means these algorithms can now do better than at least an untrained human. And for example, I don't know if you can tell which of those pictures on the left are blueberry pastries and which ones are Chihuahua dogs, but it turns out the machine learning algorithm can do a better job than you can at telling those two apart. And indeed, this example is from what was called the ImageNet competition. They canceled the ImageNet competition because too many teams were becoming too successful, and they had gotten error rates so low that you couldn't tell who was better than anyone else anymore. So they actually just ended the contest. It had become too easy for the machine learning algorithms to do. Another example of measurable progress is in the protein folding competition. So this is a worldwide enterprise that has been engaged with by hundreds of teams around the world, specialists in biochemistry. So protein folding is a very important biochemical process, but it's highly complex. These are the geometric structures that amino acids make when they combine themselves into proteins, and those shapes actually matter for a bunch of biochemical processes. So it's important to be able to predict what shape they form when certain kinds of amino acids get put together. Every 2 years, teams of academics get together and show off how well they've improved at predicting protein folding structures. And in the last meeting, CASP 13, this was a year ago, last fall, a team that had never participated before came in and won the competition, and indeed they made as much progress in about 6 months of effort as was typically seen in 4 years in prior versions of the contest. This team was from Google DeepMind, and they were not specialists in biochemistry, they were just specialists in machine learning algorithms, and they built a machine learning algorithm and an artificial intelligence wrap over that machine learning algorithm that did a better job improving protein folding predictions than hundreds of labs of specialists who had been working on this their entire careers over this short period of time. So this just gives a flavor, this kind of example for the, it's not just pure boosterism. There really are new frontiers being reached with these technologies. But that means then we have this paradox that we've got technological optimism and a sense of things happening faster than ever before, and again, some real measured progress along those dimensions on the one hand, but on the other hand, productivity growth is slow, and we would think technological progress is where productivity growth shows up. That's how we think of where productivity growth comes from. So how can we have these two things coexisting? That's the paradox that I'm going to be talking about today, and that I've been working on with a couple colleagues of mine, Eric Brynjolfsson, who's at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and Daniel Rock, who's at the Wharton School of Business. And we are trying to understand where this paradox comes from, and we basically consider 4 explanations for it. Okay? The first we call false hopes. And the idea of false hopes is that this boosterism and these examples, for what they're worth, they might be interesting examples, but it's really not going to matter in the long run. These technologies are not going to pan out. They're not going to be revolutionary, and we're not going to see productivity growth speed up again. Basically, the paradox is a false paradox because the one side of it, the technological optimism, is just misguided. The second explanation is a mismeasurement explanation, and that's the opposite of the false hopes. There, the notion is the productivity growth is real. The technology is real. The problem is we can't measure it. So we go measure productivity growth the old way, and we see it slowing, but that's a problem with how we measure productivity growth, not with the technology. That would be the assertion of the mismeasurement explanation for the paradox. The third explanation we call the distribution and dissipation explanation. And what we mean there is that the technology is real, but its benefits fall on a very select set of companies. And you and I could probably name those companies. And because those benefits are so narrowly targeted and can't be shared across the economy broadly, a lot of resources are spent by the companies that do enjoy those benefits trying to protect those benefits from their competitors. And at the same time, the competitors are spending a lot of resources trying to grab those benefits away from the leaders. And this process of trying to acquire the benefits of the technology and the incumbents shielding themselves from that acquisition burns up the benefits themselves. They're basically, most of the gains are expended fighting over the gains, in a sense. And the fourth explanation we call the implementation and restructuring legs explanation. And there the technology is real, that the potential that we saw with those examples, image recognition, protein folding, and many others, voice recognition, all sort of manipulation of autonomous vehicles, things like that. All those are real and have great potential, but to be truly gained, that potential takes time, and many different things need to happen to implement those technologies in a way for them to show up in the productivity statistics. And so you can have a period where you have the technology existing and its potential is recognizable, but it's not actually driving productivity growth on the ground as yet. Okay, so those are the 4 explanations we consider. And there's a little bit of truth to each one of them. But when we press hard, we think that the first 3 don't really measure up to the last, to the implementation and restructuring leg story. So first of all, false hopes. Why don't we think this is just, misguided optimism? Well, certainly it's not hard to point to past technologies that people have been excited about that haven't panned out. As people say, fusion energy has been 20 years away for 60 years. Okay? And there are other examples, and indeed, artificial intelligence version 1.0 in the 1980s didn't really pan out either. And so we're circumspect about what we think is going to happen with machine learning and artificial intelligence going forward. But at the same time, it's not hard to come up with examples, and I'll walk you through just a couple in a few minutes, where you can get pretty noticeable changes in measured productivity growth from just what you might think are pretty narrow applications of machine learning and artificial intelligence. And so on its face, we find it plausible that these technologies could pay off. The mismeasurement story is something I've actually spent a lot of time looking at. I have an entirely separate study that goes over 7 different reasons why the mismeasurement story basically doesn't add up. It might be 10%, 20% of the story, that some of this is a measurement problem, but basically the productivity slowdown that I showed you and that we're seeing in the statistics really does seem to be real. It's not a problem with how we measure things. It's that productivity growth is slowed. And so we have to, I think, face that as a reality and think about how to explain the world in light of that fact. The distribution and dissipation story certainly has elements of truth to it. Like I said, we can name a couple, maybe 5 or 6 companies that have enjoyed huge benefits from new technologies and start to dominate their industries. But it implies a large amount of activity. So just to give you a sense of what I'm talking about, remember that calculation I did that said US GDP would be 17% higher this year than it is had productivity growth not slowed after 2004. Well, that's $4 trillion. That's a lot of economic activity to be dissipated and somehow missed in our statistics because of companies fighting over the gains of technology. If you told me we missed $40 billion of activity in our aggregate statistics, I might believe you, but 4 trillion is an amazing number, and it's highly unlikely that we're managing to dissipate that sort of amount of resources and not be able to see it. So that comes down to then this last explanation, which we think is the most likely for what's going on with this paradox, and it's this implementation of restructuring legs. The technology is real, but it takes time to see its benefits in the productivity statistics because many things have to happen before that technology actually starts to pay off. And if this explanation is correct, then this paradox of technological optimism and poor measured productivity performance, it's a paradox, but it's not a contradiction. And indeed, both of these things are 2 sides of the same coin. One implies the other. If you are going to have a new technology that is potentially going to revolutionize how many things are done in the economy, you will expect a period before that revolution where productivity growth is slow because of these implementation and restructuring lags. And so they sort of are, again, two sides of the same coin. They're coming from the same source. It's not that they're two different things that can't be reconciled. They're reconcilable by this single implementation lag explanation. So that's what we think is the most likely story. Now, the way I've described it to you so far is sort of a case by elimination. Here are the four stories. Here are why the three first ones we don't think are right, so it must be the fourth. But we also have a positive case, an affirmative case to make for this implementation lag story as well. And that case has three parts. First, as a matter of statistics, the fact that productivity growth has been slow over the prior, say, decade tells you nothing about what productivity growth is going to be over the next decade. I'll show you that in the data. Second, I'll give you some of those back-of-the-envelope examples of what kind of productivity growth we might see from even what are fairly narrow applications of machine learning and artificial intelligence technologies. And I think that will demonstrate the plausibility of a reacceleration in productivity growth if these new technologies can be harnessed. And then the third element of the case is I'm going to argue that artificial intelligence has the potential to be the next general purpose technology. And the general purpose technology is a very specific definition in economics, and I'll explain what that is in a moment. And if that's correct, that implies some important things about productivity growth and the patterns of productivity growth around implementation of those technologies that I'll get to in a few minutes. So first, the statistical bit. So what I've shown here is the relationship between past 10 years productivity growth and the following 10 years productivity growth. Okay, so we've taken 60 years of data for this is for the United States. You could do this for other countries. Find pretty similar things. And we go year by year, and for each year we say, okay, what was average productivity growth in the prior 10 years? Then what will average productivity growth be for the 10 years that follow? And we plot the prior 10 years on the horizontal axis versus the next 10 years on the vertical axis. And when you do that, you see the relationship shown here. And that relationship is basically no relationship. Okay? In the periods where the prior 10 years has seen high productivity growth, there's no particular implication, excuse me, that the next 10 years will be fast. Conversely, in the periods where you've seen a slow decade of productivity growth in the 10 years prior, there's nothing that implies the next 10 years are going to be especially slow. There's basically no relationship. Okay, so what that means is, yes, we have had slow productivity growth for 14 years at least in the US and most of the OECD countries, but that does not imply that the next 10 or 14 years are going to be slow because of that. It doesn't imply it's going to accelerate. There's not a negative relationship either. There's just no relationship. Okay? The past decade doesn't tell you anything about the next decade. Okay? So the fact, there's no sort of inherent momentum to productivity growth, and if it's been slow for a while, it's got to stay slow going forward. Now let me walk you through a couple quick examples of the productivity potential of applications of machine learning and artificial intelligence technologies. So the one that gets discussed a lot is our autonomous vehicles. Okay, so in the United States, and I'm sorry I couldn't find comparable numbers for Switzerland for this example, but I would think if you just scale them by the size of the economy, you're going to be dealing with pretty similar situations. In the United States, there are 3.5 million people who work as some sort of motor vehicle operators. Okay, that could be cab drivers, that could be truck drivers, lorry drivers, could be school bus drivers, could be municipal bus drivers. They drive a vehicle for a living. My co-authors on this project think, based on their conversations with people in these industries, that it's plausible that the switch to autonomous vehicles could replace roughly 2 million of these drivers, okay, especially in over-the-road truck driving. That's probably one of the biggest potential sources for substitution. Okay, so that would take 3.5 million drivers and move the need for drivers down to 1.5 million people. Okay, so if you're able to do the same amount of work, move the same amount of goods and people around the same distances that you could before, but with 2 million fewer workers, you're getting the same output with less inputs. That, of course, is higher productivity. How much higher productivity? Well, total private employment in the United States is about 125 million people. So that 125 million becomes 123 million. You get the same output. That implies an increase in productivity, output per worker hour, of about 1.7%. Now, this doesn't happen overnight. It takes time for these technologies to be rolled out, of course. If it happens over a decade, that 1.7% increase in productivity is spread out over 10 years, and so roughly you're looking at 0.17% increase in productivity growth from the switch to autonomous vehicles. Okay, now note, this is just one application of this technology that doesn't even affect not even 2% of the labor force, yet you're already seeing a boost in productivity growth that would be noticeable in the statistics. Another example from work that my colleagues have done is for call centers. There are roughly 2.2 million people in the United States who are employed working as call center workers. People in the industry think that replacing some of that work with artificial intelligence algorithms could reduce that requirement by 60%. That implies doing a similar calculation to the one I showed you before. 1% increase in labor productivity. Again, if that change happens over the course of 10 years, that's 0.1% per year. So just these two examples, autonomous vehicles and call centers, if you add them together, that implies a 0.25% increase in productivity growth over a decade. And you're only talking about maybe 3 million workers total out of 125 million being influenced by the technologies. So you only need about 6 or 7 more applications of this size, and you have an extra 1.5% per year in productivity growth coming from these new technologies. 1.5% per year sustained over a decade gets rid of the productivity slowdown, and that 17% loss in GDP that we've seen will be reversed. Okay, so we find this plausible. These examples are about labor replacing technologies, but you can replace capital inputs. So Google used their DeepMind AI to, or are using it now, to reduce energy expenditures in their data centers. Of course, the thing about data centers is they use up a lot of electricity and they generate a lot of heat. And so you've got to figure out how to cool the computers so they don't overheat and they keep working. They were doing that on a sort of manual basis, and they said, well, this seems like a problem for AI. Let's take our AI knowledge and apply it to the problem, see how we could do. I'm going to show you the example from one experiment they did. So this chart shows energy use at a particular Google data center. During the time that they ran an experiment, they handed their normal management of energy use over to the AI algorithm and then took it back. And you can see where AI took over and where it was turned off. And you could see while AI was running the climate control during this period, energy use went down substantially. Okay, so this is still another example. This isn't a big example, but again, you only need about half a dozen to 10 of these sorts of things, and pretty soon you've explained away or you've gotten rid of the productivity slowdown that we've been experiencing for the past 10 to 15 years. I'd like to note that these calculations are very simple, just what an economist would call factor replacement calculations. You had one input that was doing the work. You take this new kind of technology and replace that input with it. But really, a lot of the benefits from technologies don't come from simple replacement. They come from the fact that these new technologies actually allow complementary investments to be made that boost the productivity of the technology even more. And so that I think that 0.25% from the call centers and autonomous vehicles, if anything, is probably a lower bound of the productivity growth potential that could come from those applications. Because you can imagine how, say, retail could be completely transformed if we had autonomous vehicles. You know, we already are used to going online and having something delivered to us rather than going to the store. Well, that can happen with even faster cycle without a person. You can imagine the warehouse is going to be just down the street, and there will be a robot that takes the item you ordered to your door within 20 minutes of ordering it. You can imagine the transformative possibilities that could happen when these complementary innovations are made. And that gets to the third point of the case for this implementation leg story, is that artificial intelligence might be the next general purpose technology. Now, what is a general purpose technology? It has three components that define it. One, it must be pervasive. It's general. Two, it can be improved upon over time. And three, it spawns these kind of complementary innovations I was talking about. And it's very plausible that AI checks each of these three boxes. Okay, so what is machine learning at its core? It's a predictive algorithm. Prediction can be used in all sorts of settings. So the pervasiveness is very plausible. Can it be improved upon over time? Yes. Well, it's called machine learning for a reason. It gets better. And this might be the first technology that actually makes itself better without active human intervention. And third, can it spawn complementary innovations? We think so. The perceptive and cognitive abilities of AI can be combined in many different ways in many different venues, and so therefore could be able to spawn lots of new kinds of ways of doing things. Okay? So that raises the question. I've given you the case for AI being potentially the next big leap forward in productivity growth. So why aren't we seeing that productivity growth? Well, as I've been mentioning, it takes time to get these benefits. First of all, you just need to acquire and build enough of the new technology for it to show up in aggregate statistics, and that can take a long time. Okay? It's not just one computer, it's many, many, many computers. And second, probably more important, these complementary innovations also need to be invented and put into place. And that can take years or decades. And since we're going to be talking the rest of the morning a lot about information overload, I would actually classify that as a kind of complementary asset. The ability to not suffer that cost of implementation is a kind of complementary innovation. We have to figure out how to use these technologies in a way that doesn't overwhelm the people who are using them, so that on net there would actually even be a potential loss in productivity growth. And I'll come back to that in a little bit. So let me give you an example from history of how implementation legs can happen in general purpose technologies. What I'm showing here is labor productivity output per hour in the United States starting in 1890. Why 1890? Because it was about at that time that the electric motor and internal combustion engine was first commercially available. Okay? They were invented a couple decades prior to that, but they were commercially available starting in the 1890s. So if you were, say, a manufacturer, you could go buy an electric motor and use it to run your factory rather than having a steam engine or a water wheel. Okay? That's why I started in 1890, and then I run it through the mid-1930s. And what you see here as you look over history, there's about a 25-year period of pretty modest productivity growth. So 1890 to about 1915, productivity growth is growing a little bit less than 1.5% per year, okay? Which is kind of what we're at right now in the productivity slowdown. Okay? This despite the fact that this new technology, the electric motor and internal combustion engine, is commercially available. And indeed, it's a superior technology to the alternative, water or steam power. Why am I so confident saying that? Because no manufacturer still uses steam power or water power anymore. They're all electrified. So clearly, that was the better technology in the long run. Yet, despite that fact, you've got this 25-year period. Whoops, I don't want to show that yet. You get this 25-year period. Oops, sorry. 25-year period where productivity growth isn't that fast. And indeed, in 1918, some 25 years after commercial availability of the electric motor internal combustion engine, only half of manufacturing factories in the United States were actually electrified. So the superior technology had been in existence for a quarter of a century, yet only half of this entire sector had even bothered to implement it. Okay? Once they started to implement it, then productivity growth does accelerate. 1915 and 1925, it more than doubles, near 3% per year. And then there's a second slowdown after the mid-20s. Okay, now what I'm going to do is ask you to imagine that 1970 is the information technology analog to the internal combustion engine and electric motor. So computers are becoming commercially available about this time. Okay? It's a superior technology for a different set of things, and it's implemented over time. Here's productivity growth in the United States from 1970 until today. There we go. So some striking parallels. You have about a quarter century of modest productivity growth, about 0.5% per year. Then there's a decade-long acceleration, 95 to 2004, 3% per year it was in the United States. And then, as we've been talking about, a slowdown after that. So slow, acceleration, slow in both periods, even though they're separated by 80 years. The common element is there's a new general purpose technology that is diffusing through the economy in both of these. In the early period, it was the electric motor and internal combustion engine. In the later period, it's IT. Okay. Now, we have that 25-year lag comes from it takes time to implement these technologies, and you've got to figure out how to use them. You know, no, only half of manufacturers could figure out how to use an electric motor. Well, a lot of companies couldn't figure out how to use a computer. It took a long time. Once they did, though, in the mid-90s, productivity growth took off. Okay? Now, we have the benefit of hindsight with the pre-period. We can go back and say, well, what happened after that second slowdown from 1925 to the mid-30s? Well, it turns out there was a second acceleration. Okay? Now, does that mean the second acceleration of IT has to start tomorrow? Of course, it doesn't. Okay? But it does show that one class of technologies can have two or more waves of productivity growth associated with it. It doesn't just have to have one big bump and then die off forever. It's possible that AI is sort of the second wave of information technology. Okay? Another example of implementation lags comes from retail. Okay? So Amazon is the dominant online retailer in the US. This data is for the US, although it looks similar for Europe as well. If you look what's going on, this is the share of retail sales being made by e-commerce. That's the blue line here. In department stores, the red line, and in warehouse stores and supercenters, or hyper markets, as you might call them here. Okay? Even though people were fully aware, I'm old enough to remember the 1990s, as soon as Amazon started, people said, oh, this could be a really transformative technology for the way retail is done. It took 20 years before it even became 10% of retail sales. A lot of changes needed to happen in the meantime. And in fact, what killed off the department stores initially wasn't e-commerce, it was the rise of the hypermarkets. Okay? And now hypermarkets have sort of flattened out and e-retail keeps growing. But it's really only the last couple years, some 20 years after the potential of the technology was clear to lots of people, where we've actually started to see it transform in a notable way the way that things are done in the sector. And the reason why is these complementary assets are not simple things. They're new ways of doing business. They're new kinds of human capital for workers. They're new ways of running HR and compensating workers and incentivizing workers. There's new supply chain relationships that need to be built. There's new ways of your customers to think. You know, e-retail, a big part of it was just retraining customers to think of, oh, it's safe for me to give my credit card number to an online website, which someone would have thought you were crazy to do that in 1994. Okay, so these things take time, and that's why we see these 20, 25-year periods sometimes, even after the technology's potential is obvious, before it actually starts moving the productivity statistics. And I think that's what we're kind of talking about at the core of our implementation lag story. Now, what about the information overload story? And my colleagues today are going to talk a lot more about it than I will, but I think it might be useful just to make a quick connection to what they're going to be talking about with this stuff. It's a highly intriguing hypothesis. I think it is going on. I'd love to be able to measure it. I keep asking people if anyone has really good time use data on workers. I would love to get it and do a project with them so we can see how much time is being spent just dealing with the overload issue. To me, at a first glance, it seems like more of an explanation about productivity levels rather than growth. So what do I mean by that? Well, let's suppose every hour becomes some amount less productive than it was before. You can pick a number. I'm going to pick 10% less productive just for the sake of an example. If that's true, because you're spending 10% of your time being distracted, productivity growth should fall by 10% because, of course, your inputs have gone up. You're spending more hours, but you're not getting any more output out of it. But once it's fallen to that new 10% lower level, I might think that productivity growth after that won't change. The pace of technology is what drives productivity growth. Maybe, however, the pace of technology is also related to distractions, and if the technology creators are just as distracted as the technology users, we could see a sustained drop in productivity growth. That might be the way to reconcile this notion, but I'm sure Theo and Caroline will be able to talk more about that. All right, so productivity growth is in a slowdown. It's widespread and it's costly. It is, in my opinion, the biggest macroeconomic problem we face today. We have this paradox of poor measured productivity growth in the face of technological optimism and, on some dimensions anyway, real measurable technological progress. I think the best way to reconcile that paradox is this implementation and restructuring leg story. But it's important, especially for those of you who are all in business, to remember that this implementation process doesn't happen automatically. You are the implementers. Okay? You're the ones who are going to have to figure out how to get the benefits of these new technologies, how to work it into the system with the people and the things you already have in a way that raises the efficiency of your operation in a way that's mutually beneficial to everyone involved. And that's the thing that takes time. And we know from history that it does, but ultimately it's going to be up to you what happens going forward. All right, thank you for your time.